Valerie and Tina have had a chance to get some rest. They've traveled. Wait, was it 4 vacations and 5 vacations?
What is it? More like 5 or 6, actually. 6 weeks.
And that's good. And we hope that while you're taking a little bit of time and respite, that you're also muscling up. Because if you want to continue this work, and we understand that you do, it's going to take a lot of muscle and a lot of dedication from everyone.
Right.
And so we're going to talk a little bit today about what you did. It's conversation we'll sort of have in the pluperfect, because we're going to talk about what you did, but we're also going to talk about what needs to be done as we go forward. One of the things that was clear early on in this administration is that these issues would be important. You know, the first bill that was signed was the Lilly Ledbetter Act. How did that happen? Why was that the first bill, and was that intended to put a benchmark down, to make a statement that women's issues would be key, and that this was something that was closely held by that administration, by President Obama in particular? Valerie?
Well, it's a good way to start, Michelle. And first of all, thank you for doing this, and thanks to Nira and her entire team at CAP for having us here. It's like old home week. When we walked in, Tina and I both broke into a big smile, because we had a chance to work with so many of you in this room over the 8 years that President Obama was in office, and we look forward to continuing that partnership going forward. So I just want to begin with a big shout out and thank you. So I think the president came to this issue, no surprise, as a result of how he was raised. He was raised by a single mother. He lived for a while with his grandparents, and he saw his grandmother hit a glass ceiling when she worked at a bank and trained people who leapfrogged over her. He's married to this dynamic, very accomplished partner, but he saw the challenges that she faced when the girls were young, and he'd be down in Springfield, and she'd call and say, you know, Sasha or Malia is sick, what are you going to do about it? And he's like, oh, what am I going to do about it? I'm, 300 miles away. And then he's got these 2 incredible daughters, and he wanted to make sure that they grow up in a world where they can compete on an even playing field. And so he challenged Tina and me to think through what was the best way for the federal government to get involved and ensure that we were doing right by all of the range of issues that touch the lives of women and girls. And so Tina and I did our due diligence. We looked at what prior administrations had done, and we considered, for example, housing it all in the White House. And what we learned as we did our research is that we wanted to ensure that every single part of the federal government felt invested in looking at how we are touching the lives of women and girls through a gender lens. And that's not something that one can do in isolation in the White House, because you need everyone's buy-in. And so that's how we came up with the idea of creating a council where every agency and department of the federal government would have a representation on it. And the theory was to get not just the political appointees, but the career appointees as well, to feel invested and to not look at this in isolation on just the programs or policies or legislation, but rather take a step back and work as a team on a holistic approach, because that's how you can actually have a maximum impact. So that was the origin of how we came up with the idea, and it was actually 8 years ago this month that the council was created. Lilly Ledbetter happened to be the first thing that came out of Congress after years languishing, and it moved really just like that. And the president, as those of you, President Obama, I have to keep saying President Obama now, President Obama, in nearly every recap he gave, beginning early in his administration, took great pride in mentioning Lilly Ledbetter. And we all got to know Lilly very well, and her story is such an important story because it just shows you how, one person who wouldn't even benefit from the legislation spearheaded a movement to say, if we're going to have equal pay, then we need to make sure that we put important laws in place that provide this level playing field. And Lilly, as many of you may have known, was discriminated against for years, and she had no idea until a colleague slipped her a note and said, male colleague, and said, you and I do the same job, but you're paid less. But by that point, the statute of limitations had told. And so Lilly Ledbetter says each time you're discriminated against, the statute begins again and again and again. So that's how we started.
Just a note, that male colleague, whenever that story is told, I often think about that male colleague.
He did her a solid.
He did. He
all
totally
women.
did her a solid.
All women.
And
although
it
was years, it took decades for him to come forward.
Right.
Well, and one of the pieces of legislation that we have been supporting in Congress that hasn't moved forward would prohibit employers from retaliating against their workforce when they share information. And we did it for federal contractors, but we've yet to be able to get Congress to recognize that if you want someone to come forward, they can't be under the threat of penalty for sharing employment figures.
So getting the federal government involved was key to this. And I remember the day that this was signed, I was at the White House and I was leaving, and former Congressman George Miller was leaving with his Chief of Staff, Danny Weiss, and he was talking about just this issue, getting the federal government involved. And he noted at that day that usually what the White House will do in previous administrations is bring the business community in and say, it's on you. But this time they turned to the federal government and said, it's on you. Right. Was there pushback, and was part of the goal to create stakeholders in every single government agency here in Washington?
Well, that was exactly the idea, was to create stakeholders everywhere. You know, we used to say when we talked about the Council of Women and Girls, the objective was to change the DNA of how federal agencies operated, because everything they do really does touch the lives of women and girls, and down to the very smallest hiring decisions that they make and their individual promotion and retention decisions within the agency for their own employees to big policies. You know, many of you have heard me talk about the Department of Transportation. You all know this is like my favorite example because it's who thinks about the Department of Transportation. But they did things like programs to support more women highway engineers, you know, to really promote leadership. They were one of our first partners in the federal government to step up on sex trafficking, because they knew actually that they touched all the transportation industry. So they held trainings for the bus drivers and the train operators and the airline employees so they could spot trafficking as it happened. It started right away. I was remembering when you were talking about, you know, the early days, we started in the Recovery Act. What we often forget is, I'm so proud of the work our administration did, was as we were in the middle of a fiscal crisis and developing a Recovery Act, we made extension of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit key. We put more money into domestic violence shelters, as many of you fought for and remembered, because we knew and heard about the domestic violence shelters getting hit with a triple whammy of loss of federal funds, loss of state funds, but increased demand as the stresses were happening, as people were losing their homes.
Was there pushback, though?
No, I have to say I'm really proud of our cabinet. I mean, one of the things that happened when we went out there is that cabinet members seized on this and adopted it. And in the early days, you know, Jenny Kaplan, our first executive director, and I saw Alfred Siegel come in, our second executive director, and Jordan Brooks, our third, is on jury duty today. Otherwise, she would be here. But we went out to all the federal agencies, and they would do these big presentations because they were so proud of what it actually did, I think, was unleashed a long pent-up desire to do this work and gave it permission to really grow and flower.
People wanted to be a part of something that was important to President Obama, and the fact that he valued not just his team in the White House, but the people in all of the agencies was important. But the other thing, Michelle, you mentioned the business community. It was never an either or, it's a both and. We wanted to do what we could at the federal level, but we also recognized how important it was to engage stakeholders. And we were just, before we came in, talking about our equal pay pledge, which we encourage the private sector to take, where they would commit to taking a hard look at their pay and see if there are discrepancies, look at any structural impediments, and commit to be a part of a process that says it is not just good for women, it's good for business to have equal pay. And so we wanted to get our house in order, but the success of our council, as we'll talk about more, depends upon whether or not we are leveraging the rest of the country. And the goal was never to have it all be in the White House or in the administration. The goal was to engage partners, and so whether it's tackling domestic violence and ending sexual assault on college campuses, or getting young girls interested in STEM, or whether it's all of our basket of working family issues, that is something that is intended to be a grassroots effort that we can set the framework for in the White House, but that it, flourishes outside and around the country.
Now, you talked about getting the House in order. You also wanted to actually get the White House in order and create a more supportive environment for women. What were the obstacles? What did you need to massage and adjust? And how successful do you think you were in the end?
Well, it's interesting. There were a lot of stories, I think, written early on about the testosterone in the White House. And I think there's testosterone in a lot of places. And the question is, I think my point is tone starts at the top. And so what President Obama made very clear is that he wasn't going to just listen to the loudest voices. He was going to listen to the best suggestions. And early on, I think it took a minute for some of the women in the White House who hadn't had any experience with him before to recognize that loud voices don't necessarily rule the day. And he made a lot of intentional decisions into how he created this culture in the White House that would encourage people to own their own voice and to recognize how important it was to participate.
Examples.
So a good example, and Tina would remember this, is that when President Obama would have a meeting on an issue, he didn't just want to have his senior advisors in the room. He wanted to have everybody who touched on the policy there. And if there was a junior person who looked like they had something they wanted to say but was holding back, he would lean in and he'd say, well, what do you think? And the more he did that, and the more, if you even deemed to disagree with him, he would really get excited and push and encourage and nurture, it sends a signal that all voices are empowered to speak up. And I think the other thing is that we had a critical number of women in the White House who were running departments. I think by the time we left, half of our department heads were run by women. Every senior assistant to the president, which is the highest title in the White House, every single one, with the exception of me, because I started in that title, was promoted, including Tina, under President Obama's watch. And so over the course of the 8 years, I think what you saw was when you go where you don't really have a culture in the beginning because you bring all these people together who've been working together in different places, and each one comes to the table with their history. And it took a minute for him to really create a culture, which is one where women and men took the 3 months of maternity leave. I don't know of any other White House in the history of our country where people felt not only was there a policy on the books, but that they were not just given permission, but encouraged. In fact, when people came back early, we would say, well, what are you doing here? Get back to maternity or paternity leave. And so if you have someone like a Josh Earnest, a senior press secretary to the president, who says, I'm not going to travel when my baby is young, even though that's what a press secretary always does, it sends a message throughout the entire DNA, to use Tina's word, of the culture. And so we're very proud of that, because it wasn't enough that we just have a council on women and girls. We had to walk the walk as well.
And was that catalytic?
It took a minute. I was going to say, because the men, I remember actually encouraging one of our very senior men to take the paternity leave, because he really wasn't going to. And afterwards, he sent me a note when he came back, and he said, thank you for doing that, because he was nervous about taking it, but then he took it, and the importance that it felt in his child's life, in his marriage, it was a moment, he realized afterwards that he wouldn't get back, and was really critical. But it did, I often used to say, the White House is like a lot of workplaces. I mean, it operates in our society. So while we came in the early days, thinking it would be wildly different, it was like every other big high-powered workplace I'd ever worked at. But Valerie's right, we worked at it over time, to the point where, for example, we had a moment in time where every senior White House counsel position, from the White House counsel to all of her deputies, were women. When we ended, all of the national security positions, all the senior nationals were all held by women, from Susan Rice on down within the White House. Those being two particularly male bastions in the past. So we're very proud of how we were able to move that over time. But you got to work at it. The message, I think, to employers is you got to pay attention to it, and you got to work at it.
And you have to tell your own story so people understand what you're doing.
Culture doesn't happen just because you have it on the books. Culture happens because tone starts at the top, and you have to be quite intentional about it. I remember early on, several of the women were concerned about whether or not their voices were being heard in the White House. And the president, I mentioned it to him, he's like, well, let's have dinner. And so he invited all the senior women up to the residence for dinner, and he said, talk to me. And I had said to them ahead of time, you got to be candid, you got to explain to them what's going on. And at the end of the dinner, I think everybody felt that they had been heard and that he was going to really see what he could do to help shape the culture. And he said at the end of the dinner, look, if you ever want to come back and have another dinner, just let Valerie know. And so we started having dinners amongst ourselves, the women in the White House. And at the end of each dinner, I would say, does anybody want to have another dinner with the president? And everybody would say, no, we don't need to talk to him again. They just wanted to really have that signal from him that he wanted them to get in there and that they were in service of the administration if they spoke up and said what they thought. Because that's why, if you have the extraordinary privilege of working in the White House, do not sit quietly or you're not doing your job. That was his message to them. And I think it empowered them to feel, okay, I'm going to get in there and fight for my ideas, because it's not about me. It's about the ideas that are going to benefit the American people.
It's interesting also, but making a space for people who didn't necessarily roar, asking the
Yes.
person in the room who didn't
That's a
speak
good
up
way to put it.
to share their voice.
That's a very good way to put it.
Too often when the conversation about women comes up in the public arena, there is an immediate assumption about which woman you're actually talking about. And I want you to talk a little bit about the work that you did to make sure that when you talked about that big word, women with a capital W, that it included women of color, that it included low-income women, that it included women from the LGBT community, that it included rural women, and so that it was a much bigger and broader conversation. And was there, even within the White House, sort of an easy assumption or a drift toward the idea that you were working for a certain kind of woman when you had this conversation? Did you have to remind people to be expansive in their thinking?
I don't think so. And again, back to the original construct of including all of the agencies, when you have the Department of Agriculture sitting at the table, women who are in rural America have a voice. When you have the Department of Interior, you have Native American women who have a voice. And one of the interesting things that we did is looked at intersectionality, which I don't think I even knew what that word meant before I joined the White House. So for example, if you think about sexual assault, transgender women of color have a much higher frequency of sexual assault than any other group of women. And so it was important for us to really drill down and focus on who is going to be most impacted, who is most vulnerable. And so we couldn't afford to just look at a homogeneous, typical woman. By definition, we had to have a big tent.
Well, and I think it was infused through everything we did. So starting with things like earned income tax credit, and child tax credit as some of the biggest investments we made all the way through. And I'll be honest, one of the frustrating things for us was this idea that we weren't paying enough attention. When My Brother's Keeper came out, there was all this, where's my sister's keeper conversation that happened when, in fact, all along, from day one in the administration, as Valerie points out, we had been including the issues concerning a whole diverse group of women in big ways and small ways. But then one of the things we did do was to pull that work together, because clearly it wasn't being highlighted. So we pulled that work together and both highlighted it and working together with the Ms. Foundation and the fabulous women's foundations from across the country came together with a $125 million investment called Prosperity Together for low income, working women of color. And then together with the Anna Julius Cooper, Center and Melissa Harris Perry, another $80 million in investment in research by and about women of color. And really highlighted that. And that's something, again, that's continuing on. And Ms. Foundation is continuing that work, and we're really proud to have launched that.
So in some of these initiatives, you really leaned directly into controversy. And
Women and girls, controversial?
Well, in some of the issues, and particularly around sexual assault, that was an issue. It's the adjudication around those issues are very fuzzy and complicated and often in a very defensive space. And the White House stepped broadly and boldly into that arena, talking about bystander culture, talking about, we want to make sure that people understand that you need to hear yes rather than assume yes. Similarly with the work that you did around making sure that rape kits were more broadly distributed and to deal with the backlog there. Did that also lead not just to an impact on the ground, but I'm also curious if you talk a little bit about the decision to lean into that controversy, but also I'm always fascinated by the conversations inside the House when you decide to do this.
Well, keep in mind, the president's the first time we ever had a senior position in the White House focusing on domestic violence, and so reporting directly to the vice president. And I think that enabled us to have a very important partner on at the table, but then also, and where's Catherine? I know she's Catherine Lehman and her predecessor at the Department of Education really were our partners on the policy and said, look at the data of what's happening. We have 1 in 5 women who are experiencing sexual assault while they're in college.
That means some of them are working here in the federal government and maybe in this room.
Daughters who
well,
are in college.
This is the thing, is we all had
we have
daughters.
college-age daughters.
And I wish that when my daughter went to college that I had asked just some basic questions about the culture on her campus. And I didn't, and I felt terrible having put her literally in harm's way without having any idea. And so I think because we had so much support coming from the Department of Education and the Vice President and President were committed to this, we didn't look at this as controversial. We would have considered it irresponsible to see an epidemic and not do something about it. What other epidemic would you have in the country where 1 in 5 people are victims of it and you wouldn't address it immediately? But we created, the president created a task force, and we had a whole range of listening sessions with stakeholders, from survivors to school presidents to local police department heads to campus police to academics to advocates to student body presidents. And over a period of time, we had them come into the White House and tell us what would be the solution. And what we heard resoundingly is, this can't all be on the university, and it can't all be on the local police, and it certainly can't all be on the survivor. What you need is a it's on us approach, where everybody feels responsibility to ending the epidemic. And what's been encouraging to us, even since we left, Civic Nation has taken on this It's on Us campaign, is that you have, 250 campuses around the country.
No, 550.
500? Are you sure
500.
it's 500?
It is
There-
550.
All right, so we've got a whole lot of college campuses who've now said, we want to be responsible for changing the culture. And this gets back to the issue again, where you can't just have on the books of the university, we don't tolerate sexual assault. You really have to get everybody feeling a sense that we don't want to be associated with a university where this is tolerated. And leading that effort has to be the students. They need to have the support from the university. They need to have an aggressive, involved Department of Education through the Civil Rights Division, who recognizes their responsibility to monitor and have a place where people can go when they file a complaint and know that that complaint will be taken seriously. And the fact that we saw a huge uptick in the complaints filed under Arne Duncan and then obviously John King, to me didn't indicate more sexual assault was happening. It indicated that people felt that their voices were being heard, and that their claims were being taken seriously, and that they would be fairly adjudicated. And so, yes, that work continues after we leave. So I don't think we ever considered it controversial. We thought it was a delicate issue and one that had to be handled responsibly, and that we had to be fair, because let's face it, it's important to know for our boys who are on college campuses too, that they're going to be treated fairly, and it's going to have a devastating impact on somebody's life if they are wrongly adjudicated. And so fairness was extraordinarily important. So delicate and really important. Never would I say controversial.
On a delicate issue like that, then, is it an example of using the power of the bully pulpit at the White House to help others who think it is perhaps not just delicate, but absolutely controversial and perhaps highly litigious for them? So for the regents and the trustees, and for others who were in a somewhat crouched position for years trying to figure out how to deal with these issues.
Well, it's a good example, and we have a couple of others too, where the role wasn't just policy. You started with the policy, and you had a great foundation of policy in Title IX. But then it was about changing culture. And I think some of the work that is really outlasting us and will continue to outlast are the ways in which we've changed culture and changed culture in the last 8 years. And It's on Us is a good example of just investing a whole new way of talking about these issues among college students. And the most proud thing is when these young men, who are frat guys and had, the leaders of their football team come forward to make these It's on Us videos and have come to the White House to speak quite passionately about this issue. It's part of the reason we did the Working Family Summit that Neera mentioned, and that was to really pull all those issues together to celebrate the work that we've done as a federal government, and then push the envelope out further to say, here's we put the research out from our Council of Economic Advisors to demonstrate why it's good for business, not just the right thing to do, but return on investment is high. This is actually how you're going to organize your workplace of the future, and to change the way the culture talks about things like paid leave and equal pay. And I kind of think it happened, at least because both parties have had, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the fact that it's accepted that you have to say something positive around things like paid leave and childcare and working women, not that it's an anomaly that women should be working, but that we actually have to facilitate it happening. I think that's something that happened over the course of the last 8 years.
And sometimes you actually have to provide people with a language.
Yes.
To help them figure out how to address certain things. I want to ask you about the summits. The Council co-hosted 2 major conferences, the White House Summit on Working Families and the United State of Women. I want to hear from you, Tina, on why it was important to do these, about the goals that you set, not just for the actual conferences, but the long tail, the work that would flow from those conferences. And as part of that, important in setting a benchmark, understanding that there might be a moment where you would need to reach back and look at the work that came out of this, the studies that came out of that.
So that benchmark, Michelle, you're absolutely right, was to take a moment in both working families, and the United States of Women was all of our work. So economic, education, women's leadership, healthcare, violence against women, entrepreneurship. In those 6 pillars, having a moment where we did celebrate and gather all of this body of work that the Obama administration had been able to do. And it is now there, and you can point back to it, and it's there. But it was also much more important to propel it all forward. So in the case, as I just mentioned, of working families, it was, to take those issues and put them square center into the boardroom, into the, if you're going to manage your manager's, expertise as a CEO, you should be paying attention to these issues the same way you're paying attention to how much every widget costs to make, because this is part of how much every widget costs to make.
Because what
gets measured gets changed. And then, the United States of Women Summit was both to celebrate that work, but also to galvanize women at the grassroots level and with a national voice around this basket of women's issues. Because our sense was, we in the White House, everybody would come talk to us, all the different organizations working on issues, but we could see people who were working in the same area not talking to each other. If they were doing it internationally and domestically, they'd be working on the same issue, they'd be talking to us, but they weren't talking to each other. And we wanted to create a place where all of the organizations came together and we could support them all. And it did. 5,000 people last June. It was terrific. First Lady, the President, Oprah, Shonda Rhimes. I mean, it was, Vice President. It was a wonderful collection. I am really happy to say and proud to say that Civic Nation, again, is continuing. United States of Women. The brand exists at Civic Nation, not in the federal government. They've continued to build and grow that organization so that it is a grassroots galvanizing organization in service of all of our women's organizations who just do such great work and providing a national voice. They had 57,000 people on a call on the week leading up to the week of action a couple of weeks ago, just to get everyone trained and organized in how to, go to their town halls. And Rachel, where's Rachel? Rachel Berman, stand up, Rachel. If you want more information on unitedstatesofwomen.org, we will do the summit again coming up, and there'll be announcements, but you can follow up with Rachel right there.
So what's at stake in this moment? What needs to be done to make sure that this work continues?
Well, that's going to depend.
Someone in the audience, we were at church for a minute, someone in the audience went,
We all took a sigh. We took a sigh, but I will say this, and I think Tina would agree. I'm very optimistic about our momentum going forward. I think a big part of where we take pride is that this was not something that began and ended in the White House or even in the Obama administration. We engaged so broadly around the country, and the fact that so many people would want to get on a phone call and figure out how they could be active, I think is really important. The fact that the private sector now recognizes that in order to be globally competitive, issues like affordable childcare, equal pay, paying a family a wage that they can support their family on, paid leave, paid sick days, that these are no longer women's issues. These are issues that are important to business, they're important to our economy, and if you want to attract and retain talent, when half of the workforce is now comprised of women, 40% of single moms are either the sole or primary breadwinner, a woman's contribution to the family income is more important than ever. And employers are beginning to understand that, and there is mounting evidence that shows that if you invest in your workforce, you will have a more productive, more loyal workforce with less turnover, and in the private sector, more profitable. That is a change in culture, and it's as a result of awareness that has grown over the last 8 years. And so I think part of what we have to all do collectively and individually is to figure out how to continue to educate the private sector, not just the private sector, but employers. It's important in government too. That you need to recognize that when women succeed, America succeeds, and there is truth to that.
Yeah.
When women
succeed, America succeeds. You all know that from Leader Pelosi.
Well, and we should give her a huge shout out. Tina and I went up and briefed the leader in the Women's Caucus prior to the president giving a State of the Union about 4 years ago. And they said to us, you know what we think really resonates is this phrase. And so we came back and we encouraged.
This was 24 hours before the speech, by the way.
Yes,
it was really pretty close to that.
It was pretty much done. but it was placed in the president's speech with his approval, and it was one of the largest applause lines that he received, as it has been every time he's used it since then, because I think it resonates with both women and men. These are not women's issues anymore. We are far too important to the workplace, and it's not also, I mean, the point, and we touched on this early on when we talked about the policies in the White House around paid leave and paid maternity and paternity leave, but men increasingly are making this a priority for them as well. I think about my daughter and her husband, and their relationship is a much more equal than mine was with my husband. And it's just a generational change, and so the younger generation of men and women are demanding wholer lives, and I think our children and our elderly parents will be far better off with this change in culture. And so I say this to say I am hopeful that there is momentum that has been built as a result of our time in the White House that will continue, and that there are a critical number of members up on the Hill who understand how legislation around these issues and national solutions are important. But in the meantime, we also have a lot of momentum at the state and local level. And you have mayors and governors and state legislators who are looking at ways of putting a lot of our policies in place through legislative solutions at the same time as we continue to put pressure, and now we can say put pressure on Congress.
We can actually say that.
Encourage everyone to talk to your elected representatives and tell them how important it would be to have more. We are the only developed country in the world that does not have a national paid leave policy. The only one. How could that be when we are the ones that are the beacon of hope and should be leading on this issue?
So if this is important to you, what are the specific things people can and should do? And is it possible that an issue like paid leave or finding quality daycare or universal pre-K will be bipartisan issues? Because no matter where you live in America, no matter at what income strata you happen to be on, that's the kitchen table conversation. That's one of the biggest cuts of the nut when it comes to the family budget, outside of your mortgage, outside of healthcare, is those early daycare costs and eventually education costs. So 2 questions.
Well, there's several things, and CAP's a leader, obviously in laying out what's going on in the federal government and federal policy and keeping an eye on it and giving the rest of us the policy directions we need on where to push and where to pull. I would also say acting at the state and local level is hugely important, and that's an opportunity. It's a big push of what we've been pushing out through United States of Women and elsewhere. Because we've had, over 35 jurisdictions, state and local, that when we got blocked with paid leave or paid sick leave, congressionally, went and enacted it locally. And I think those are models for everyone to go back to their home states and organize on issues like transgender bathrooms. Go to your local school board and advocate for those trans students. On childcare, go to your states, to focus on that. And it's those state solutions that are, quite frankly, easier to work bipartisan, easier to get wins through, because those legislators have to live down the block from their constituents when you're an alderman or you're a state rep. And it'll be important, I think politically, for us to get more people active at the state and local level. And then that's going to bubble up. Washington follows more than it actually leads. So if we're getting those solutions out there right away, very quickly, in the near term, then we're going to be able to create more momentum pushing things forward here.
I was just tell you a concrete example of why your voices are so important is the legislation that's going through right now on the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
We have to pay attention to what the impact is going to be on women and poor people and elderly people. And CAP can educate you on that and tell your stories. I think that part of why we're seeing what we're seeing now in reaction to what's happening at a lot of these town halls is that the town halls are not being manipulated by people who are being bussed in from somewhere else. And if you ask the legislators, they will say that to you. They look in the room and they recognize their constituents. And what their constituents are doing is they are telling their story about how important healthcare is to them, how important it is that it be affordable, how important it is that the Medicaid expansion that captured so many people who would have been lost without it cannot be something that's just left up to the discretion of the states in a willy-nilly kind of a way. And I think there is nothing more powerful than the story. And so use social media, show up at town halls, contact your legislators at the federal and state and local level, and make sure that we are not going to lose the enormous progress that we've made, particularly for women under the Affordable Care Act. Without Planned Parenthood being funded, there are millions of men and women who are not going to have basic services. This is not about abortion. 3% of what they do is that. The rest is providing basic, important health care, screening for cancer, for example. And men have to tell their stories about how they have gone to Planned Parenthood for services and debunk a lot of the myth and the rhetoric that you have coming from people who are just trying to promote a dishonest agenda.
And I would say it's not even a red and blue thing. I mean, even if for those of us a lot of times say, well, I'm in a blue state, I'm in a blue district. I've been saying to people, even if you're in a blue state, in a blue district, go show up. Because we need all of the Democratic members of Congress to feel the same pressure, both to stand strong and for them to empower them to go back when they come back to DC to say, well, guess what happened in my town hall too? You know, yeah, they were all supporting me in doing it, but they all showed up because they care. We have to show that this is something that people care about in every corner of the country.
I believe in the power of narrative. I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller, I run a deep and rich narrative archive, and I actually keep the names of people whose stories are important. I literally keep them with me in my notes section. Some of them are slaves, some of them are members of my family, some of them are people whose shoulders I stand on, some of them are people that I've just met on the road and their stories touched me, and I literally keep their names and occasionally I say their names. So what I want to do in ending this is for you each to tell us a person who you met along the way whose life was changed because of the work that you do.
Well, I'll start because I was just thinking about her the other day. Ashley Black, who I met in South Carolina, where she was a community organizer for the Obama campaign back in 2008. And she told, the way we worked back then is that the field organizers were really our bosses. And Tina and I both worked for people who were our children's
20
age.
years old.
And they were, because they had been on the ground and got to know a community. And Ashley brought me into a library, and she began by telling her story. And she told a story about when she was 8, her mom was diagnosed with cancer. And she didn't have health insurance, and was having a hard time keeping her job, and lost her job actually, because she couldn't keep up. And so Ashley tried to figure out as an 8-year-old how she could contribute to the family income, knowing her mom was struggling. And she somehow figured out that condiments were inexpensive. And so she would ask her mother for mustard sandwiches and mayonnaise sandwiches and ketchup sandwiches, and tried to convince her mother that she liked those sandwiches as a way, because she said, what can I do? I'm 8 years old. And so she saw firsthand what lack of health insurance was doing to her mom. And she said to herself when she heard then Senator Obama say he was running for president and he wanted to do it and fight for health insurance for everyone, she said, I want to go work for him. And she quit her job and moved to South Carolina because she said, maybe he'll help my mom. And so fast forward, I saw Ashley about a month ago, and I asked her in front of the group that we were talking to tell her story about her mother. Her mother was able to get health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, and Ashley came and joined us in the White House for a while, working for Tina's team over in the Office of Public Engagement. And I think about Ashley and her mom, and I recognize that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to eat ketchup sandwiches because she wants her mother to live. And we're just so lucky that Ashley's mom is still alive, but there are a lot of moms like Ashley's who will be at risk if the Affordable Care Act is not kept in place.
So, it's hard to isolate across 8 years. There's 2 people, and neither of whom I'm embarrassed to say whose names I remember. But because healthcare is so important, I'm focused on those. One is, some of you may have even attended it. We did an event with Mrs. Obama, when we were trying to get the Affordable Care Act passed. That was a women's health. I think we probably did it during Breast Cancer Awareness Month, because it was a lot of survivors of breast cancer who spoke at this event. And I tell this woman's story a lot. I remember this woman who stepped forward as a breast cancer survivor. And she told the story about how, now that she's a survivor, she needs to get screenings, every, 2-3 months, to make sure her cancer hasn't returned. But because she was a breast cancer survivor, her premiums were through the roof. And this is in late 2009 or early 2010. We're still in a financial crisis. And she said, look, the choice, it's so expensive that the choice for my family is between keeping a roof over my family's head or having health insurance for these screenings I have to have. And she said, And my choice is to keep a roof over my family's head.
So she just didn't
she
do
was
the
without
screenings?
health insurance, without these screenings that she had to give. The other person is, in the 2012 re-elect, I did a lot of work here in DC, just in the ground, going to phone banks. And I went to one phone bank here that Corey Marshall organized. And it wasn't Corey, but it was another one of his volunteers who stepped up. And this is a young person who was, just out of college. And she said, the reason I'm here is her brother didn't have health insurance back, when we were before '09, and died. He was literally someone who could not go see a doctor. By the time he was finally in an extreme setting and got to an emergency room, it was too late. And from something that had he had health insurance and been going to a doctor, he would have lived. And she said, and that's why we have to re-elect President Obama. That's why we have to keep, Obamacare. And we have forgotten. The thing that happens in our country is our memories are too short. If you think back to '08, on both the Republican and the Democratic side, all anybody talked about was the need to get health insurance. Because of all these stories, we were living with this horrible system, that was broken. And even if you had employer-based health care, you didn't get the coverage that you needed. And we have forgotten. We have, now had 7 years of Obamacare, and we think that now it's just about bending the cost curve, or it's where the premiums are. And we've forgotten that people's literal lives are at stake. And we have to your point, retelling these stories, we have to not only tell the current stories, but I think we have to go back and retell the stories of what it was like just 8 short years ago. And we could so easily go back to that.
Thank you so much for telling your stories today.
Oh,
and thank you for the work
and
that
thank
you
you
do.
to CAP.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tina Chen, Valerie Jarrett. Thank you very much. We're on to our second panel. Jocelyn.
Thank you. Great. Very impressive.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you. What a wonderful conversation to follow. And thank you again for being here. I'm Jocelyn Fry. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress, and I'm with our Women's Initiative. And we really appreciate all of you being here. We had a lot of interest in today's discussion, and we want to pivot. We really want to pick up where Michelle and Tina and Valerie left off and really talk about looking forward and looking at where we go in terms of charting a course for women and really talking about a forward-looking agenda. And when we talked about doing this event, we really thought this was a critical moment because we do have a lot of progress that we could build on, but we're also at a critical time. And at the same time, we've seen enormous activism amongst women and men across the country. We've seen tremendous leadership of folks like the Women's March, and we see work of the United States of Women, and there's just an extraordinary interest among people. I'm sure many of us have had this experience of people that we know in our lives who never before went to a march, never got engaged, who now are really engaged in a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about. So we pulled together a really wonderful panel of people to really prompt a conversation. And I'll summarize their bios briefly. Let me just say that, we could spend an hour just talking about all of their accomplishments, but I'm just going to be brief. Starting with Wendy Chun-Hoon, who is the co-executive director of Family Values at Work. Wendy is a great partner. She works a lot on paid sick days and family leave and family leave insurance. She engages a number of coalitions at the state level and works with a network of thousands of workers and activists across the country, small business owners, really engaging on a range of family leave policies. Prior to going to Family Values at Work, Wendy also worked in a number of foundations. She's a frequent speaker and is really a leading expert on work-family policy. So Wendy, thank you for being here. Seated next to her, Catherine Lehman is the chair of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. She served as, I think Valerie mentioned, prior to that as the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the Department of Education in the Obama administration. She has a wealth and breadth of experience as a litigator, a civil rights litigator, and we're going to talk to her a lot about just her work as an enforcement official. She's been recognized as a leading litigator and lawyer across many years, so we're excited to have you here. Seated next to her, Serene Jones is the 16th president of Union Theological Seminary. She is the first woman president in, I think it's 180-year history, and which is, it's definitely worth applause.
Way too long to take that.
But it's great to have you here, and she has some spectacular titles: the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. She also is the president of the American Academy of Religion. Prior to that, she was on the faculty at Yale Divinity School for, I think, over 15 years. She was the Titus Street Professor of Theology there. She is a very highly regarded and well-known speaker, has written a great deal, and is widely sought after for a lot of her perspective on a range of theological issues. So thank you for being here. And I just want to, I'm going to jump right into it. And I think I want to pitch a general question to all of you for a quick comments, which is, why do you think we are here having this conversation in 2017? I mean, I think there are lots of people who think, why on earth are we still talking about some basic issues around women's progress and women's rights? You know, what is it that's holding us back? Is it a law? Is that it? Do we just need to pass a law and we'll fix it? Is there something deeper? What do you think is going on? And I'll start with you, Wendy.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be part of this. I mean, really, basically, I think we have somebody in the White House who bragged about sexual assault on the campaign, and the fact that this wasn't a disqualifier for so many people, shows that, misogyny, among other things, is alive and well in society. And then I think, probably a little closer to home, the way in which the issues that we're talking about that Tina and Valerie really provided such great leadership on, and the president, are often framed as sort of trivial or, privileged white women. And these are really issues that impact all of us. And so, when the media, when sort of influential elites are talking about these issues, they're not, and recognizing the leadership, they're not talking about, the hugely powerful groups of, networks across the country like National Domestic Workers Alliance and Restaurant Opportunity Center and 9 to 5 and our Walmart, who are providing huge amounts of leadership and really bringing forward, their base, women, men, everybody. And that's not the face that gets represented on these issues.
Right. Fair. Catherine?
I'll certainly echo that. The painful reality is, as Thomas Jefferson is famous for having said, which is that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And by eternal, we mean eternal. The reality is that we are far from the mountaintop for equality. We have made enormous strides. We've made enormous strides over time. We've made enormous strides in my own lifetime. And we have not yet attained the equality that has been our birthright promise, that is our constitutional minimum, that is our statutory minimum, that we say is our goal. But we aren't yet there. So why are we here now is because we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And it's such a pleasure for me to be here at the Center for American Progress, to be here in this room with all of you who care and who are committed and who are the legion who will move forward so that we will actually attain the progress one day that we have been promised.
And I completely agree with what you have both said. And just to add a slightly different perspective to it, I think that we are still here because culturally we have only scratched the surface of the degree to which gender difference constructs everything about who we are, what we understand the nature of our world to be, and how we interact with each other. These things have been living in us for thousands and thousands of years, and you can't undo them overnight. But we have to have the courage to ask the questions about how do gender stereotypes and all that goes with that live in our bodies and our unconscious minds and practices we do every day that then jump up to surprise us when Trump is elected. That uncovers a sort of glacial presence in our culture of a massive amount of work that needs to be done.
Well, that's, thank you for all of your comments. I think that sort of is a good launch into our conversation. And, I actually want to pick up on your point, Serene, because I do think that there is so much that is in our culture that sometimes we don't even know about. And one of the narratives that's out there is that when you start talking about women's issues, women's progress, you start talking, with the F word, feminism, right? That somehow, you can't talk about feminism and religion in the same breath. Like they're of course in conflict. Feminism is something over here, radical and crazy, and then there's tradition and religion. And can you give us a sense, because I know there are lots of folks who have various aspects of their faith lives. Why do you think that people sort of present these issues as sort of in conflict, feminism and religion? Do you think they're in conflict? Are they inherently in conflict, or can you reconcile them?
Well, a couple answers to that. First of all, it needs to be acknowledged that they are perceived as in conflict because for much of history, in fact, religious communities and their doctrines have been responsible for the oppression of women and the constraining of the conditions of their flourishing. That's just the truth of the matter. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that since the 1950s in this country, there has been a concerted effort backed by an enormous amount of money and power that has targeted progressive religious communities with the attempt to undo their legitimization, because religion is considered such a threat because it mobilizes moral power. And if you can connect religion, as it has been in this country, with feminism, you have something unstoppable. And as we all know, in this country, the women's movement began in churches and in synagogues. It began as a religious movement. It expanded quickly because of the scope of its base, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ella Baker, Ida B. Wells, these are the women that gave to us the contemporary women's movement and an understanding of what it means to be feminist in America. But we can't underestimate how much the religious right and political conservatives have invested in breaking that tie between religion and progressive politics.
And so, that's helpful, because I think it is a good reminder that when you name some of those, legendary women who were really founders of the movement, that much of their work was rooted in, religion and religious expression. So that, I think that's helpful context. I want to pivot a little bit to Wendy. A lot of the conversation today is going to be focused on how do you make progress, right? Like, how do you make progress today and where we have been and in the current environment, as complicated as it may be. And how would you describe to folks the state of play? And what opportunities are there for progress? What do you think are the issue priorities that folks ought to be focused on?
For the past decade, more than a decade, our focus has really been these very tangible things that Tina and Valerie were talking about. Paid family leave, paid sick days. For those of you that haven't thought much about this, we're talking paid sick days a couple of days a year where you need, to get better yourself or to care for a loved one. Paid family medical leave, a slightly longer amount of leave. This is once or twice, handful of times in your lifetime where you're going to need this type of support. So, for the past decade, have been really building this as strategic to gender and racial justice, because we ought to be able to provide both for our family and to care for our family and not be threatened on the job when we need to do those things and be good family members. So, you're right, a lot of these opportunities at the state and local level, and our investment really has been to build capacity to win these types of policies locally. I think our kind of theory has been that we've always known that we're going to need a handful of examples at the state and local level to really push this conversation. So somebody said it earlier, I forget, about Washington sort of following. We believe that. I mean, we have to, show that this can be done, and have been laying down those tracks as a path toward federal reform. So I think, regardless of the election outcome, this is the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, picking up on that point, I mean, because you do work so much at the state level, do you think that that work actually gets heard in D.C.? I mean, why is there such a disconnect between what's happening at the state and what's happening at D.C.? Is there an ability for folks at the state to really help shape and influence what's happening here?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I said this maybe in the opening, that I think for too long the conversation here has really been focused on, professional, managerial, women in these professional managerial jobs. And, this kind of false, can you have it all argument. What we know locally in communities is that this is not about having it all, this is about a danger of losing it all. And I think what's been tremendous about the state and local power building, and things like the summit, and things like this lead on leave tour that the administration did, which was hugely helpful in really elevating, and through these campaigns, elevating the voices of everyday women and their families, men too, so that they are being seen and heard, and it is rising up, and I think folks are being heard. Yeah.
Great. Great. Catherine, I want to pull you into the conversation a little bit because you bring a unique perspective as the chair of the Civil Rights Commission, and also your perspective from OCR. And I first want you to talk a little bit about your current work and what role you think the commission can play in supporting women's progress, either on issues that Wendy has raised or just more generally, addressing gender discrimination.
Thanks. The job of the United States Commission on Civil Rights is to be the federal eyes and ears for every American on every issue of civil rights and equality and fairness that affects them, and then to present policy recommendations and review the status of federal enforcement on those issues. So it's a pretty big charge, and certainly the requirement of ensuring forward progress for women is well within that charge, and all of the areas that we look at in the Commission touch on women's multiple statuses. As both, I think, Valerie and Tina mentioned on the last panel, women have multiple identities, all of us. We all have race, we all have sexual orientation, we all have age, we all have ability status, we all have sex and gender. All of those parts of ourselves touch all of our lives. And so we need to be thinking about, we in the Commission, we all of us as Americans need to be thinking about what opportunities we do and we don't have, and what we need to safeguard the floor for those opportunities. I am pleased that when I came on to the Commission, obviously the Commission had a 59-year life before I came, and will have a long life after I will leave it at some point also. But by the time I came on to the Commission, my fellow commissioners had already voted to take on issues that are explicitly in the realm of sex equality. So that includes status of women in prisons, it includes sexual violence, which is obviously a familiar issue for me, so ready and able to speak to that issue. It includes diversity in the high-tech sector. And then it includes things that are not focused specifically on women, but are all of our lives: Native American sovereignty and rights, equal access to educational opportunity, fines and fees, collateral consequences of incarceration, a whole variety of issues that touch all of us. And so in my life in the Commission now, for certainly the next 6 years, which is the tenure of my appointment, we will be focused on making sure that all women in all states across the full spectrum of our identities are safe.
Thank you. That's very helpful. One of the things you just said harkens back to, I can't remember now if it was Tina or Valerie who said this, but there is historically sort of this notion of what women's issues are,
Yes.
right? Like there's sort of nice, one set of issues, they're off on the side, you deal with them, on the appropriate days or anniversaries, and then you go to the serious issues, right?
That month.
Right, exactly. And, I think, as you sort of talk about the body of work that you're working on, is one part of this conversation broadening and deepening our understanding of what we mean when we talk about women's issues?
Yes.
That they're not just, one particular set of issues, but a broader set of issues. Is that sort of part of the work of the Commission?
I think it is. I think it's part of the work of the Commission. I think it's part of the work for all of us. I mean, one of the reasons that we are here, having made as much progress and as little progress as we have made over time, is that we have been too compartmentalized, and we have suggested that there's something that somebody else worries about, not something that each of us worries about. And I think all of us need to stand for all of us and for each of us to make sure that we are speaking to the needs, the hurts, the pain, and the rights for all of us as we do all of our work. So when we're focused on healthcare, when we're focused on faith, when we're focused on housing, when we're focused on education, when we're focused on putting a roof over our families' heads, whatever the issues are, those are issues that matter in our core for all of us, and either we stand for them or we don't.
So, Serene, when you hear Wendy and Catherine sort of talk about the breadth of issues that they work on, and sort of how women's issues really touch every aspect of society. I think another narrative is out there that somehow women's progress or women's advancement, women's leadership, and their ability to navigate things like the tech sector and non-traditional sectors in the workplace, that somehow that is in tension with religion, right? Like that's not sort of traditionally the roles that women played. And I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but what advice do you give to women, and how do you talk about women's progress and the importance of women being able to advance and do all a variety of things, but still, and that it is consistent with their living a life of faith and consistent with religious values?
Well, one of the most ironic things about this present moment is, as we saw in the election, huge numbers of white evangelicals, many of them middle class, voted for Trump. And the administration is using religion quite often as a justification for many of its biases, in particular gender. And yet the administration itself have not stepped through the door of a church. They are not a particularly religious group of people. So we have to always be careful about how religious justifications are thrown around, and whether or not the person making a religious justification even knows what they're talking about. Because in all of the world's major religions, there's a core set of values tied to profound responsibilities that we have to one another, a deep sense of equality, and the call to love. I mean, that's the sort of universal running through different religious communities. And I think the vast majority of religious people in this country, of all stripes and character, don't hold the view that women should be oppressed, should be less than men, should be paid less, should be forced to stay home, should be in any way diminished because of their gender. I just don't think that's what it means to be a religious person. But I do find it interesting that when we talk about our many identities, even now, religion gets left out. Like, one of the features of that intersectionality is that in the United States, most people are still religious, and some of the biggest differences and conflicts that exist across religious lines, both within Christianity, but between Christianity and other religions, and also between religion and secularism. I mean, these are huge divides that have to do with our deepest values that have been surfaced and have to be addressed if we're going to move forward as a nation. They can't keep being stomped down because progressive political people feel uncomfortable talking about religion, and that includes progressive religious people. But it's sort of there and has to be engaged directly.
Well, I think, it's so interesting that you say that, because I think part of this conversation, and really, Valerie and Tina had these themes in their conversation as well, is the importance of surfacing these issues. That the way to address some of these challenges is not to put them on the side or pretend that they don't exist, but really to put them squarely on the table and confront them head on. The other thing that I wanted to raise with you, because it's really connected to something that Wendy said earlier, is that, when we a lot of the challenges that people face concerns care of their families. And a lot of times when those care challenges happen, they go to their faith institutions for support, or just trying to figure out how they're going to navigate all those sorts of issues. And so I'd love your perspective on, how well do you think we do as a nation in terms of valuing things like care and caregiving? Is there something from your perspective that you think we need to be doing better than we've done before?
Well, there's a lot we need to be doing better. But it is interesting to think about the role that care plays in religious communities, and historically how care has been associated with the domestic labor of women. And this is a historical comment, but really since the European Enlightenment, which sort of created this category of labor, which was the work that men do in public, and reason, which is the thing that guides that labor, and all of this sort of massive amount of other work, which is, you know, having children and raising them, growing, preparing, feeding people, creating a space where people can sleep, taking care of the sick and the elderly, creating the context for leisure and joy and entertainment and pleasure, and all of these things were put in the domestic sphere, and they were also relegated to the realm of religion. And it's no accident that 80% of the religious communities in this country are filled with women. I mean, that is who the vast majority of people who are actually doing regular religious practice are. So the reason our churches have, in some degree, become providers of care is precisely because it's been the place where the women have been. We now have a crisis because as women have stepped into the workplace, which is a wonderful and necessary thing, as a culture we have not attended at all to the loss of that energy for care that was necessary for a society to function well. And we're all breaking down because of its absence.
You know, that is really interesting, and an interesting connection to what Wendy was saying earlier about the need for supports for sort of the way the families are operating now, right? Like your point about, you know, care may have been provided here or there, but, you know, when women went to the workforce, and even before then, that there is sort of a need now for a different set of supports. And Wendy, you know, you talked earlier about just the work that you were doing around a variety of work-family issues at the state level. And the other thing that strikes me about that is that a lot of times at the state level, these are, I mean, sometimes they're partisan, but sometimes less so. But somehow when they get to DC, like something happens, like in the water, I don't know, and they become, you know, completely partisan, and people, you know, can't, you know, talk to each other, or at least acknowledge that these policies are important. Why do you think that's happening? And Tina did speak to, you know, there are changes that are happening, but what do you think is happening?
Yeah. I do think it's different at the state level and at the national level. I mean, really, frankly, I think it's this extreme right wing of the Republican Party that's made it impossible for there to be any sort of bipartisanship on something that is so logical, and this sort of concerted, you know, attack on moderates in the Republican Party to be on the right side on this issue. Or maybe it's the lack of the moderates' ability to kind of mount some resources and some savvy to say, no, you don't speak for me. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, that's what's happening. I also think somebody, I think you mentioned it, Serene, this really deliberate sort of corporate lobby that almost becomes kind of a religion, not to misuse the word, but, you know, who identify, you know, they sort of claim this or do this identity theft is the way we talk about it in these campaigns, you know, identity theft of who small business is and what they actually stand for. So that anybody who feels like they're on the right side of these issues and stands for them is being told, you know, you're anti-business, you know, which is like the end-all be-all. When in reality, in every single one of our coalitions across the country, there's massive, you know, business support. I mean, small businesses stepping up, leadership, being vocal, you know, getting it at their absolute bottom line core of their whatever their business is, that this is the right thing to do. And it's really, you know, attributable, I think, to some of the good work of the place that these coalitions provide in actually speaking up and getting engaged, but also some work done by, you know, Main Street Alliance and American Sustainable Business Council and Small Business Majority, who have really become partners in trying to break this identity theft.
Well, it's your use of the word identity theft and culture, I think really harkens back to something that Valerie and Tina were speaking about earlier. And it does seem that, as we look at, how do we make progress, that we are talking in part about a change in how we think about these issues from, the women's silo and sort of, putting the issues to the side and moving these issues sort of front and center into conversations about the workplace. And is it a change in culture that we really need to have happen around the workplace and sort of how we think about these issues as being fully integrated to a broader public policy discussion?
Yeah, and one of you said it, Serena, I think this was you. It's sort of, we have to see the sort of root of the problem as rooted in the oppression of women. I mean, everything about the care sector, the service sector. I mean, this is like a systematic undervaluation of women's work. And, this assumption that all families still have, a stay-at-home wife, who are providing all the care, and really sort of the development of labor standards around this fictitious all men's workforce. I think these issues really, we need to move into the space, and I think we are. I think we're definitely having success here, where we're moving out of the personal and into the systemic, and I think this is absolutely the solution. The coalitions across the country include parents and, yes, caregivers, but health advocates and seniors and businesses, as I said, LGBTQ groups. I mean, this is really, it's recognizing that these issues touch all of us, that there is a role, a very important role that everybody plays, that we're not saying anymore, it's not even worth talking about whether this is or isn't a women's issue. This is an everybody issue. And I think, this is about a what should our country look like issue. I think there was really sort of a helpful shift for us thinking about, we hear so much, what is the unintended consequence of policies like these? We really started shifting to, no, there are intended consequences, right? This is about, better economic security for families. This is about better attachment, stronger attachment to the labor force for women. This is about better child well-being. This is about, quicker recovery when you're sick, when a family member is sick. So really shifting to that, these are the intended consequences we need, that these policies bring us, right?
Right. Intended versus unintended
Exactly.
consequences. Yeah. Catherine, both Wendy and Serene have talked a lot about attitudes, old attitudes, and sort of the shift in attitudes that we need. And I do want to build on your experience, particularly at the Department of Education, because a lot of your work around sexual assault and sexual violence in part stems from very outdated, backward attitudes about relationships between men and women. And so I want to get your perspective about, I know we don't have a ton of time to talk about the root causes of everything, but your perspective on sort of where we start, right? Like, where do we start at getting at some of these attitudes that lead to some of the issues that you were dealing with on college campuses? Is it college? I mean, I assume that it's even earlier than that. But I'd love just your perspective on how we begin to tackle some of these stereotypes that lead to some of those outcomes.
This is a plug for It's On Us, but I really am a believer that it is on each of us to try to address those attitudes and to make sure that we also have agency in knowing that we can be the change that we want to see for our lives. Where do we start? We have to start every day, everywhere, and certainly with our youngest children as well as with adults who are near us and adults who are older than we are. The reality is that sexual violence knows no age boundary. We know that preschool children, we know that middle school children, we know that high school children also can be subject to sexual assault and are in ways that are unbelievably distressing as well. And we also know that our kids bring to college and universities the lived experience that they lived before they went there. And so it's important to start the training early. And it's also important for us, all of us, to take every opportunity every day to try to address it. I will tell a story about how I lived that in my life. I am a mother of two daughters. when my girls were babies and toddlers, you would teach them about their body parts. This is your eye, this is your ear, this is your vagina, who gets to touch it, mama to bathe you, your doctor to check you, you because it's yours, and nobody else. And this is what happens if somebody else does or tries to touch you. You say no, you go and you tell. You say no, you go get some help, and you tell a trusted adult so that you can be safe. That was something I said to my children when they were far, far too young to have understood, because I wanted them to be ready when and if what we know to have happened to too many women and girls would happen to them. And I think each of us needs to be that vigilant, that daily about it, to have that just be in the ether of what we know, so that if you find yourself in a situation you don't want to be in, you have tools to figure out how to navigate your way forward out of it in a healthy way also. And we need to be doing some version of what I did with my two girls for all the people that we know, whether we love them the most in the world, which I do for my two daughters, or whether we don't know them from Adam, but we care. And so that means if we see something that is unsafe, we should speak up. If we are present in a conversation where we hear something that is homophobic, that is sexist, that is ageist, that is inappropriate in some way, call it out for what it is, so that you are part of the change, so that we don't live in a culture where we expect. I will say, OCR just entered into a resolution agreement in this administration. It had gone into negotiation before I left, but they entered into a resolution agreement with a K-12 district in which an assistant principal reported to OCR that the assistant principal had heard 25 accounts of sexual harassment from the principal on students and had not come forward because she didn't feel safe, because she thought she might be retaliated against. 25 accounts that she had heard about. That was 25 times that she could have been there, an upstander for some students in her K-12 district who knew her, but she didn't know how to come forward because she didn't feel safe. That has to change. We really need not to wait for the 26th time that another adult who is the leader in our midst hurts somebody else before we then say, okay, now it's the time to act. We actually need to act now.
Well, you raise an important point, and you talked about It's on Us, and I think several of you have talked about sort of the personal responsibility that we all have to really change how we think about a variety of issues around women and women's progress. But one of the issues that a lot of people talk about is the need for our institutions to change, right? And that much of this is, I think Tina used the word DNA, that this is, in our DNA, and so that includes the DNA of the structures that make up our country. And so, now at the commission, but also at the Department of Ed, we're part of an important, powerful enforcement agency. And, I know everybody loves to say that they're for equality, everybody's for equal this or equal that, and, policymakers love saying it, but they never love supporting.
Been really nice about enforcement.
The mechanism that makes equality sort of real in the lives of people. And so I want you to talk a little bit about the importance of institutions, enforcement agencies,
right,
the government, taking some responsibility to actually addressing some of the issues that we're talking about.
Sure, and to be clear, I'm no longer in an enforcement agency. The commission is a watchdog agency and does not have enforcement power. So I am watching aggressively now
yes,
in my new life.
Understood.
But when I had enforcement power, what we lived was what I believed to theoretically be true, which is that if you make a promise, it doesn't matter unless it is actually enforced, unless it is actually lived in students' lives. And students were the people for whom I was doing enforcement in my last life. The promise of Title IX became true for all of us from Congress as a gift in 1972. That is a year younger than I am. We were fast forward into this century talking about whether the promise of sex discrimination extends to sexual violence in school. The history is that immediately after Title IX became law, there was litigation to make clear that the sex discrimination promise does extend to sexual harassment, does extend to sexual violence. The Reagan administration in 1981 put out guidance talking about the obligation to not engage in sexual harassment through Title IX. That's something that the Department of Education had been enforcing quietly right along. But what had changed in the Obama administration was the lack of quietness, was speaking to, we are serious about this. This actually will change. We have to enforce. And the reason that we made as much change as we did in those 8 years was because we were serious about enforcement, was because it no longer became optional to comply with what Congress had promised for every student in every school across the country. But actually, schools expected the federal government might be there to take away their federal funds. And this is where I will bring in the commission. The commission in the early 1960s recommended that the federal civil rights agencies have enforcement power that include the purse, that includes ability to withhold federal funds. That should be the last resort, but the commission was prescient to recognize the need for actually using that. And then when the enforcement agencies weren't really using it, women's rights, civil rights organizations started suing and saying, you do need to use it, and we need to make sure that we are there to protect it. And the commission was there again after an unfortunate United States Supreme Court decision to advocate for and to press for the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which made clear that the enforcement power, the withholding of federal funds, can extend to all federal funds where there's a civil rights violation, so that it is a meaningful tool. We know we lived that if you don't use that, if you don't make clear that you're serious about the promise, people won't live the promise. And that just is a sad cycle of our reality, but it is there. And so we really need to ensure that our federal civil rights agencies know that, live that, use it, and are serious about it, in addition now also to our state civil rights agencies, to our community organizations, to our private litigants, and all of us, in the way that we expect that when we work hard to actually pass a law, when we work hard to enact a policy, that we then are there to watch it afterwards to make sure that it is actually lived.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Serene, I want to pick up on that point a little bit because, we've talked about the importance of a variety of actors, sort of engaging on issues that are, yes, important to women, and people think about them as women's issues, but they're really, sort of much more basic, issues that are important to families. There's been so much conversation about extraordinary activism across the country on many of the issues that we're discussing, some that haven't come up, and it's really been, I think, exciting for a lot of people to see the engagement of folks on the ground. When you think about folks that are your colleagues or other faith leaders that you come across, what responsibility do you think the faith community has to engage on some of these issues?
Well, they have absolute responsibility to be engaging on all of them. And I mean, talk about where our images and our understanding of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, where does that begin? It begins in the moral story we're taught about the purpose of our lives and the character of our coexistence. And if religious communities aren't teaching a positive, strong story about that, but rather have a God who is vengeful and harsh and violent, that's going to be reproduced in people's behaviors. It's been wonderfully exciting to see the faith community really over the past 4 or 5 years become reactivated as we see growing social movement energy. It's often not seen as vividly at the policy level, but just for one example, I mean, Standing Rock was a deeply religious movement that was taking on issues related to tribal rights and climate change. But at the center of it, it was an understanding of who cares for the earth. That's a spiritual issue. And it was exciting to see religious communities from across the United States end up at Standing Rock, joining in that. I think also of the present reemergence of the sanctuary movement. While we see cities becoming sanctuary cities and many universities taking stands on sharing of information or access to campus, it's right now the religious communities that are actually taking the next step and promising actual physical sanctuary to people who face final deportation notices. because they're willing to take that risk because it's so deeply embedded in their sense of who they are in the world, that you welcome the stranger, that you provide rest for the weak and for those who are afraid. And I think we're just going to see more and more religious activism of this sort.
That's, thank you for that. That's so helpful. And it actually touches on a point that I had wanted to raise earlier, which is, all of you in some way have talked about the fact that women don't live in silos, right? We don't live in vacuums. We don't just have one issue. We have a lot of, interconnections and intersections in our lives. But yet, oftentimes when people are talking, particularly in the public sphere, about women, people think that they know who they're talking about, right? Like one group of folks, they write a book, they live elite lives, and they think that's who women are, right? And don't, think about them in the diversity or complexity, racial, ethnic, and otherwise, that is really the reality on the ground. And, Wendy, I know that a lot of your work is trying to tease out some of those issues. And, what do you think we need to do going forward to make sure that as we talk about women's progress and talk about issues that affect women, that we are thinking about women in their true diversity, and talking about, women of color across all different colors, and LGBTQ women, and a variety of folks. How do we pivot that way?
Yeah, I think what you're really talking about is sort of, repositioning, fighting back from the sort of status quo of how business gets done, which is if you're at the table, you decide who gets to sit at the table, right? Mm-hmm. So you were talking about this earlier. I mean, when I think about my own work, I'm not coming to this work as only a woman, or only a person of color, or only a mom, or only a lesbian, or only a care provider. We bring our whole selves to this. So, where it really meets, sort of rubber meets the road for us, is when you're thinking about the types of policy change that we're fighting for, you are going to get less of an outcome if you aren't making sure that in these coalitions, that they're broad and diverse, that you've got faith leaders, that you've got LGBTQ groups, that you've got people who want to end violence, you've got health providers, you've got businesses, like I said earlier. Unless you have everybody informing that campaign, that decision, you're going to end up with some policy that's less than, that is not inclusive, that doesn't recognize the intersections of every one of our lives. So I think it's really starting there with your own work, making sure that you are opening that table, making sure that you are, as inclusive as possible, making sure that you recognize, in your own work, that unless you are operating in that way, you're going to have less of an outcome. And I think that, the way in which we build these networks and, have, the way in which these coalitions operate is what's going to sort of build that infrastructure that's going to really endure. It's bigger than this is just one issue kind of campaign, right? And that's going to help us, create the vehicle for making change in 18 and 20 and beyond.
Thank you for that. I have two questions actually for all of you, and I'm going to ask you to answer them quickly because I know we're going to run out of time. But your point about how everybody has to have a seat at the table is, I think, a really good segue into talking about the present moment again, because one of the dynamics that I think many people have seen is this need to pit groups against each other, right? Like, come up with a policy on childcare, but only wealthy folks can use it and not low-income folks, or, a paid leave policy that only, works for birth moms and not for adoptive moms or other parents. And I want you to, maybe each of you touch on, what do you think we need to do to sort of avoid the traps of pitting groups against each other, right? Like, I think people have felt that for a while of, this problem, it's not my fault, it's that person over there who came over, we need a wall for, or something like that. It's that type of conversation. How do we get past this notion of pitting groups, pitting women against each other? What can we do different? Now, I'll start with you, Serene.
Well, we first have to recognize that we do it.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize that it's not just other people that do it, but that progressive women who work on all of these issues do it all the time. And I think that that ability for institutional and self-interrogation about what are the assumptions that I have about who should be present and who am I not excluding because I'm deciding to exclude, but I'm just excluding them because I don't even see them. They don't exist. And so how do we cultivate habits of critical imagination? And then secondly, I think those habits grow when you're actually willing to put yourself in conversation with and work with people that you would not normally interact with in the course of your life. It's no accident that one of the most terrible decisions that's come out is the Muslim ban. And that is only possible in this country because so many Americans live and work with Muslims but know absolutely nothing about them and have never had a conversation with them about what it means to be Muslim. And within the feminist community itself, there's still horrible, deep prejudices against headscarves, against what it means to be Muslims, assumptions about Islam. I'm just using that as an example of one of those places where we have a lot of digging to do. And I think that, thirdly, I'll say, needs to include a willingness to have open conversations about, and this goes back to what Michelle was saying in the wonderful interview, about what are the stories we tell about what matters most to us. And can we listen to other stories, and can we begin to create a story that holds all of us in it? Because that's what it's going to take to move us forward. For me, that means taking the time, to, when I go back to Oklahoma where I'm from, just actually sit and talk with my evangelical relatives whose theology I just cringe at and who make political decisions I abhor. But I can't put them over here in a faraway world and continue to try to advocate for policies that I think that I'm only going to advance because I'm able to shut them down somehow. That ultimately is not the way we're going to move forward. I'm sorry that wasn't very quick, but
Yeah, no, but it was helpful. Thank you, Catherine. From your perspective as a watcher and observer, how do you push back against sort of this tendency to sort of have folks pitted against each other?
For me, I have the luxury of being charged with watching across all the identity statuses, and so in my job, I have to do that. And I also think it's valuable for each of us to try to think that way. And so it's important to, whatever your point of entree into social activism is, if you're going to marches, go to the marches for the issue you care the most about, and maybe join someone else's march, and maybe invite some of the other folks to yours. If you're a consumer of news and you're thinking about what's happening in the news, certainly watch your own news station, but maybe watch the news that's not really for you, and pay attention to some of the other issues as well. If you're taking a news holiday, which I hear about more and more from people, maybe you're going to do some research in another area. And maybe what you're doing is doing your job extraordinarily well, but go volunteer in a school that's not your children's school. Go meet somebody else where they are and find out what they need. I think some of it is taking us out of our comfort zones and making sure that we have access to information about your relatives in Oklahoma or whatever the identity status that doesn't feel like home to you. Find a way to learn about it so that it can be home and so that you can own it and use it in your advocacy however you're advocating.
Wendy?
Yeah, I think really thinking, so for us, really thinking about how these coalitions are not going to respond to the absolute tactic that's happening right now, which is divide and conquer, right? So making sure that, we're not just like, yeah, we're laser focused on winning some policy reform. Like, that's very real.
Thank you.
But that you're not just, having the blinders on, that you're using those spaces to call out oppression in every single one of its forms. So being really clear about that as a strategy and recognizing, you didn't quite say this earlier, Serene, but you might be thinking it. I think about this a lot. And I just feel like it's okay to say it, like this merge of the culture, the corporate right and the Christian right. and just how much structure there is behind that, so that you get to a place where, you know, they're talking about a wall and dividing families, like ripping families apart, where you're talking about codifying discrimination into laws around all these, you know, all these bathroom bills, where you're talking about, you know, taking away a city's right to be able to pass laws that are good for its citizens, like, you know, what we're talking about, basic labor standards, basic employment protections. You're just taking that right away from cities to be able to do that on behalf of their citizens. And just recognizing, you know, how deep this is, sort of where the money is behind this, and how we need to name it out really specifically, call it out, and then fight that way.
Last question for all of you is, you know, if you were approached by somebody that said, you know, what's the most important thing that I can do right now to really support, you know, I say women's progress because that was the title that we came up for the event, but really it's, you know, the progress of families and on a wide range of issues that, you know, historically many women have maybe focused on. But what's the number one thing I can do? What do you tell folks? What do you think I should be doing right now?
I can't, I mean, every conversation I've had with our leaders across the country, you know, they used to call a meeting and 20 people would show up. You call a meeting now and 250 people show up at least. So, you know, I think everybody is really trying to, this is a huge opportunity. Yeah, it feels that urgent, and you're trying to figure out a way to give people a home for organizing long term, like give people a place where they can connect to tangible policy reform that's going to, you know, better their families, and then keep them engaged to this kind of like real serious, you know, systems reform. So I think, you know, my response would be drive more resources to those, you know, in community on the ground who are really, really spearheading this fight.
And I think a species of that same thought. I mean, be engaged, and I don't think it matters how or where you're engaged. I love that there's 250 people showing up now, and there should be 500, and then there should be 1,000. I mean, you know, what we need to be doing is voting. We need to be volunteering. We need to be in conversation. We need to be actively engaged in the community that we want. And this is a different moment. I think that's exciting. I'm glad it's a different moment, and it's not different enough. And we need to find a way to sustain that. And so each of us needs, at the dinner table, in schools, in our workplaces, in our conversations, wherever you're going, stay engaged. That I think is what is going to be most important for us.
Serene?
Well, I think it's important to reflect on what it is also that you have to bring that's unique to the table. And in my case, you know, the head of a seminary, I think two things. One, I think building religious literacy in this country, you know, it's a startling number. What, 95% of the people in this country don't know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite Muslim, and that's a stunning reality. But closely tied to that, I think that one of my own jobs and progressive religious people's jobs is to call out and challenge the religious right and not let them have religion, and challenge them religiously to exactly as you're saying, Wendy, say, building a wall is a family values issue, and taking children from their mothers and fathers. It runs fundamentally against our core sense of what it means to be a human being in family. And to just do that as forcefully as we can. Don't concede the moral ground.
Thank you all. This has been really a wonderful conversation. Thank you. And we have time for a couple of questions. I see a hand that popped up right there.